Hi folks and welcome back. In the last video I spent some time motivating standpoint epistemology, trying to make sense of taking up this perspective that the position in which one is standing, in particular the social position in which one is standing, can have some effect on what it is possible for one to know. So it's a rejection of the traditional view that knowledge is that anyone could know anything in principle, right? The traditional view says that there are only epistemic factors matter to whether or not one can know. And standpoint epistemology says, no, it's more than merely epistemic factors. Social factors can matter to what it's possible for you to know. And it rejects the ideal of objectivity of traditional epistemology. It doesn't reject the idea that there is some shared truth that it is possible for us to know, some shared truth that is out there. But it rejects the idea that it's possible for an individual to abstract away from their own experiences in such a way that they can individually have access to that shared truth. We need the differing perspectives that are available within our social structures in order to grasp what they're really like. And some of those perspectives might have greater access to that shared truth than others. Some of those social perspectives might have a better view of things. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce the three central theses of standpoint epistemology: the thesis of situated knowledge, the epistemic privilege thesis, and the achievement thesis. So let's get started on these three. Probably the central thesis of standpoint epistemology is the situated knowledge thesis. This thesis says that we are socially situated knowers. Our perspective, our social perspective on the world can, in some cases, give us some epistemic privilege, make it possible for us to know some things that it is not possible for others to know, and in some cases stand as a kind of epistemic constraint. That is, it can sometimes make it impossible for us to know certain things that some other people, because of their perspective, might be able to know. So it might put some blinders on us in some cases. So it matters where we are situated in our social structures, whether those be economic structures and material structures, as we're going to talk about, or whether they be social normative structures or institutional structures, as we're also going to talk about. It matters where we are placed within those structures. That can have an effect on what it's possible for us to know and how we can come to know things about our shared reality, about the world that we live in. There's no view from nowhere, according to this situated knowers, this thesis of situated knowers. We can't just abstract away from an individual's perspective and claim to have some objective view of things. Usually, claims to objectivity are attempts to shut down claims from marginalized perspectives, to shut down knowledge claims from marginalized perspectives. When we claim that we have an objective understanding of how things are, that we are in that privileged position of having abstracted away from the particularities of our own experience, we're usually saying that the perspective that we've gained from our own experience is better than someone else's, is more objective than someone else's. And it's that kind of move that standpoint epistemology wants to reject. It wants to say, no, nobody can actually extract themselves from their circumstances in that way. We are all constrained by our circumstances. And so it is going to be the case that some people have a different view of reality than you, a different view on reality than you. And the only way you're going to come to learn what's really out there is by engaging with them and listening to their perspective as well. And what shapes these perspectives are non-epistemic social facts about the person. These non-epistemic social facts partly determine whether that person is in a position to know some proposition. Which social facts? Well, their race, their gender identity, their class, their sexual preferences, their ability or disability, right? All of these social facts and others, right? These are just a few examples. All of these social facts and others, though, shape our experience, right? They put us in a particular social setting. They shape what experiences we have, who we associate with, how we relate to different aspects of our reality, what sorts of norms we rub up against and feel as if they are binding on us or they are constraining us, and what sorts of norms we feel are just a good fit for us, right? All of these factors are shaped by these social facts about us. And our experience with all of these factors, our experience with our relationship to production, our relationship to reproduction, our relationship to all variety of social norms, our experience with those can put us in a position to know something that someone else might not be in a position to know. Well, how does that work exactly? Well, the standpoint epistemologist says that some social positions, some standpoints that you might take up are privileged or have some epistemic privilege, and others are not. That is to say that they have some epistemic advantage that can be drawn from being in this position. And usually this epistemic advantage can be drawn from being in positions of powerlessness. It's people who are lower in social hierarchies, who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who are relatively powerless compared to other classes, who might be in a position to understand those social systems that they're living in much more clearly. They might be able to grasp them because they experience those social systems not just as enabling them to do whatever it is they feel like doing, but as constraining their behavior, as telling them, no, they can't act in those ways, no, they can't access those goods, no, they can't get that job, right? They feel them as constraints, and when you feel them as constraints, you become more attentive to them. So let me just take a second to use a really simple example here, it may seem like an irrelevant example at first, but I think it sheds some light on this. One thing that being in this position can do is that it can make one more attentive to certain patterns of experience. It can direct your attention in particular ways. It can cause you to pay more attention to something when it happens to you over and over again, or when you first recognize that it's happening or someone tells you that it's happening, you notice it more. It becomes more salient to you. And the example that really sort of clarifies this for me is like when you get a new car, or get anything new, a new shirt, a new dress, a new phone, you notice when other people have that same item. For me, it happened like I drive a little dinky little Ford C-Max, and I bought it a few years ago. And I would have said I'd never seen this car on the road before. There aren't that many of them out there. I'd never seen this car on the road before I got it, before I got in this car, before I bought it. It's kind of a nondescript car, so it's possible I just never was paying attention. Once I bought it, once I had this car in my possession, saw them frickin' everywhere. All of a sudden, these cars are all over the place. Like there are two that were parked in my neighborhood that I'd never noticed before I had my own. It made me more attentive to this item because now I can relate to it in some way. Similarly, I may become more attentive to certain social facts when they affect me than when they don't, right? If I don't have my attention drawn to them, I'm just not going to pay attention that this is a thing that happens. For example, that people of color are more likely to be followed around and suspected of shoplifting if they're in an expensive store. I wouldn't have known that from my own perspective. It's not something that would have been apparent to me. I've probably seen it happening before, but I didn't recognize it as that when it was happening. But if I were in that position, if it happened to me, if I were a black person, it happened to me walking through a store, then I'd be able to pick it out all over the place. I'd be more attentive to it. There's also the fact of double consciousness that puts people in a position of powerlessness, or gives epistemic advantage to people in a position of powerlessness. The idea of double consciousness is that when you are in a position of powerlessness, when you are an oppressed class living in a society under an oppressor class, you have to be able to navigate both your own social reality and their social reality. You need to be able to talk to them, to speak their language, to see the world as they see the world so that you can understand how to engage with them. But you also need to be able to understand the world from your perspective and make sense of your experiences. But in a dominant class, they don't need to understand the world from your perspective. This is very clear if we think, for example, about servants and masters, or slaves and masters. We might think, the slave needs to understand what the master wants in order to avoid being beaten, in order to avoid being punished. They need to understand how the master views the world, and need to be able to relate to other slaves and how they view the world. But the master doesn't need to care about what the slave wants or how the slave views the world. The master can live in his own bubble, or her own bubble, and be oblivious to this other reality that is the lived experience of the slave. But because the slave, or because those who are in oppressed positions, have to navigate across this social divide, they have a better chance of perceiving the actual social reality, the social facts that members of the dominant group simply can't see. Right? They see how this social structure affects people on both sides of it. They see how this social structure is set up and what's holding it in place in ways that those members of the dominant class simply cannot. And this is going to affect what evidence one has, right, from the experience that you have and from the testimony of others because of who you're talking to. It's going to affect what one recognizes as evidence because you are going to be more open to certain kinds of narratives that you have some relationship to or that you have some experience with. Right? The claims that fellow members of your oppressed class are making are going to be more salient to you than they are to someone of an oppressor class. And it's going to affect what claims one entertains. It's going to affect what hypotheses you're willing to entertain and consider possibly true. They're going to be different for you depending on your perspective. But it's important to recognize that epistemic privilege, according to the standpoint theory, is an achievement. Being in a powerless social position, lower on some social hierarchy, doesn't automatically bestow this privilege on you. It's not as if, like, you are born into servitude and so you suddenly have a better grasp on what reality is like, or that you are born into the working class and suddenly have a better grasp on what reality is like, or that you are born black and have a better grasp on what reality is like as a result of that. It is a kind of achievement to have this epistemic privilege. It requires a certain kind of work. It puts one in a position where epistemic privilege can be gained or achieved through constructing epistemic and hermeneutical resources that allow you to make sense of your experience, that enable you to better understand the social experience that you're having through acts of consciousness raising. Now, I'm going to unpack what hermeneutical resources are, epistemic and hermeneutical resources are, and what consciousness raising is in the next lecture. So I'm just going to stop right there for now, and we'll pick up in the next lecture.